I was 54 years old when my life changed forever. At the time, I thought my days would stretch on in the same steady rhythm they always had. Nothing extraordinary, nothing flashy, just the comfortable, familiar life I had built over decades. Looking back now, I realize how much I took that stability for granted, how I believed the people I loved would always be there, how I thought I had more time. My name is Anna, and this is the story of how everything I thought I knew collapsed in a single day. And how, somehow, I learned to build a different life from the pieces that were left. For most of my adult life, I was defined by two roles: Daniel's wife and Claire's mother. Those two titles carried my world. Daniel and I met when I was 23. It wasn't some love-at-first-sight movie moment. He wasn't the loudest or the most handsome man in the room. He was quiet, with a steady presence that felt like an anchor in the whirlwind of my 20s. While other men tried to impress me with grand gestures, Daniel listened. He remembered the small details I mentioned, the book I was reading, the way I liked my coffee, the story about my father fixing the car in our driveway when I was a girl. He wasn't trying to dazzle me. He was simply there, solid and kind, and I felt safe with him. We married 2 years later, in a modest ceremony at the church where I had grown up. I remember my hands shaking as I held my bouquet, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of realizing that this man, standing beside me in his slightly wrinkled suit, was going to be my partner for the rest of my life. We didn't have much money then. Our first apartment had thin walls and a leaky faucet, and the upstairs neighbour played his radio too loud. But we had each other, and that felt like enough. In those early years, Daniel worked long shifts at the factory, while I took on part-time jobs, waitressing, temp work, whatever I could find. When Claire was born, everything changed again. She was small and pink and fierce, her cries filling the tiny apartment. I was terrified of failing her, but Daniel would scoop her up with this calm smile, as though fatherhood came as naturally to him as breathing. "We'll figure it out," he'd whisper to me in the quiet hours of the night, rocking her back and forth. And we did. We built a life piece by piece. We bought a little house in a quiet town. I started working at the library, where the smell of old paper and the quiet rustle of pages made me feel at home. Daniel spent weekends fixing up the house, never satisfied until every corner was sturdy and dependable. He had this habit of making pancakes on Saturdays, always too many, always a mess in the kitchen, but always with a grin on his face as though breakfast was a celebration, not a chore. Years passed in the rhythm of ordinary days: school concerts, scraped knees, birthday parties, bills to pay, laundry to fold. There were arguments, of course, moments of frustration, slammed doors, long silences. But underneath it all, there was love. Not the fiery, dramatic kind, but the steady, enduring kind. The kind that builds a life. When Claire grew older, she grew restless, eager to see more than our small town could offer. She moved to the city for college, then stayed there for her career. She called often, sometimes every night, her voice bubbling with stories of her new job, new friends, new apartment. I missed her terribly, but I wanted her to fly. That's what we raise our children for, isn't it? To give them roots and then wings. By the time I was 54, life had settled into a gentle routine. I worked a few hours each day at the library, Daniel worked at the plant, and our evenings were spent side by side in the living room, him watching an old western, me with a book or my knitting. It wasn't exciting, but it was ours. I thought it would last forever, and then came that Thursday morning. The sky was overcast, the air cool with the bite of late autumn. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee when the phone rang. It was unusual. Most people didn't call that early. When I picked up, the voice on the other end was shaky. It was one of Daniel's co-workers. He told me that Daniel had collapsed at work, a heart attack. He said the ambulance was on its way, but his words blurred together, heavy and unreal. I drove to the hospital in a daze, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, every red light feeling like a cruel trick. When I arrived, a doctor met me in the hallway. His face told me everything before he even spoke. Daniel was gone. I remember the room, the sterile smell, the beeping machines that had already been silenced, the white sheet pulled up too high. I remember staring at his hand, still wearing the gold wedding ring we had exchanged 30 years ago. I remember thinking, but he was fine this morning. He kissed me goodbye. He said he'd be home for dinner. How could he be gone? Grief is not one loud moment. It's 1,000 quiet ones. It's reaching across the bed in the morning and finding nothing but cold sheets. It's making coffee and realizing you only need 1 cup. It's standing in the grocery store staring at the peanut butter he loved and knowing there's no point in buying it anymore. In those first weeks, the world became unrecognizable. People brought casseroles, neighbors checked in, friends sent flowers. But after a while, life moved on for them. For me, it felt as though time had stopped. The house was unbearably silent. I stopped going to the library. I stopped cooking. I lived on toast and tea, sometimes forgetting to eat at all. I let the plants die on the windowsill. I barely noticed. At night, the silence pressed down hardest. I would sit on the couch, staring at the wall, listening for sounds that never came. Sometimes I would think I heard his footsteps, or the sound of him humming as he worked on something in the garage. But of course it was only my imagination. I wondered who I was now. For 30 years I had been Daniel's wife. Without him, that part of my identity crumbled. I felt invisible, as though I had faded out of the world and no one would notice. Months passed like that, days blurred together. I went through the motions of living but felt hollow inside. One evening, while half-heartedly tidying the living room, I noticed a box tucked behind a row of photo albums on the shelf. Curious, I pulled it down. It was covered in dust. Inside, I found letters. Letters I had written to myself when I was in my 20s. I sat on the floor and read them, one after another. Some were dramatic ramblings about love and heartbreak, the kind of things you laugh at when you're older. But others struck a deeper chord. I had written about dreams, travelling the world, learning to paint, writing a book. I had been so full of hope, so certain that my life would be filled with adventure and creativity. Somewhere along the way, those dreams had been folded up and forgotten, just like those letters. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about that younger version of me. She had wanted so much. She had believed in herself. When had I stopped listening to her? Around that time, Claire called me. She had been worried. I could hear it in her voice. She said, "Mum, maybe it's time you do something for you. Not for me, not for Dad. For you." Her words lingered. At first, I dismissed them. What could I possibly do now? I was 54, broken, tired. But something in her voice made me pause. A week later, I signed up for a painting class at the community centre. It was a small decision, but to me it felt enormous. I hadn't painted in decades. On the first night, I almost didn't go. I sat in the car outside the building, my hands gripping the steering wheel, convincing myself I was too old, too late, too lost. But some quiet voice inside whispered, "Just try." So I forced myself out of the car and into the building. The class was nothing glamorous. A circle of people of all ages with easels and brushes, the faint smell of turpentine in the air. But as I dipped my brush into paint and dragged it across the canvas, something stirred inside me. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was life. For the first time in months, I felt awake. There was a man in the class named Michael. He was in his early 60s, soft-spoken, with kind eyes. He painted clumsy flowers and laughed at his own mistakes. Week by week, we began to talk. Not about heavy things at first, but about small details. Books we liked, meals we cooked, stories from our childhoods. I wasn't looking for romance, and he wasn't offering it. But he gave me companionship, a reminder that connection was still possible. Slowly, I began to piece myself back together. I went back to the library. I cooked real meals again, sometimes inviting a neighbour or a friend to share them. I watered the plants and watched them come back to life. I filled the house with my awkward, colourful paintings. My home no longer felt like a tomb. Grief didn't disappear. It never does. I still missed Daniel every day. Sometimes I'd reach for 2 coffee mugs in the morning before remembering I only needed 1. Sometimes I'd hear a joke and instinctively think, I can't wait to tell him, only to remember I couldn't. The ache stayed, but it softened. It became part of me, like a scar, always there, but no longer bleeding. Looking back now, I see that the day Daniel died was the day I lost the life I thought I would always have. But it was also the beginning of another life, one I never expected. A life where I was forced to rediscover myself, to pick up old dreams, to find joy in unexpected places. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: we are never too old to begin again.